Hello, my name is Shamuel. Welcome to my YouTube channel Indigeno Incivilito. Indigeno Incivilito is Italian for civilized indigenous, and this name might not make a whole lot of sense for English-speaking people, but the idea behind it is that in the last 5 centuries, inhabitants of remote areas, the so-called indigenous, have been considered uncivilized beings just because their cultures and customs were different from the European or the so-called Greco-Roman or Judeo-Christian civilization. And since I can fairly be considered as an indigenous person, and since I have also spent my entire life studying within, but not only the Judeo-Christian framework, I figured I might just as well be called civilized indigenous. Today we are going to talk about 2 concepts, 2 ideas, which I think a lot of people misuse or misinterpret, me included. And the 2 concepts are the concept of Africa and the concept of African people. But before we begin, I would like to present you with a scenario that will serve as a common thread or a story arc for this discussion. And the scenario is this. If I met an Indian person and I were to ask him or her this question, where are you from? I am sure that the person will answer me by saying something like, I am from India or I am an Indian. Everyone would undoubtedly find it bizarre if the Indian were to say something like, I am from Asia or I am an Asian. I myself would find it strange indeed, because there isn't such a thing as an Asian identity. But if I asked the same question to a person from, say, Cameroon, it is very likely that the Cameroonian would reply by saying something like, I am from Africa, or I am an African, and so forth. And here comes the problem. Maybe not that big of a problem, but still, it's something I thought it might be worth discussing. Because statements like this suggest that Africa is one nation with peoples who share the same history and the same ancestral values and ideas. But nothing couldn't be as far from reality. Africa is the 2nd largest continent in the world in terms of population, with 54 independent states and thousands of cultures, ethnicities, and languages. But why do many people have this impression that Africa is one nation and not a continent? Why do Black Africans refer to themselves primarily as Africans instead of using their own national identities such as Cameroonian, Nigerian, South African, Tanzanian, and so forth, or even say their own ethnic identities like Fular, Wolof, Baman, Igbo, Zulu, Hausa, Iwondo, to name but a few? Well, in this episode, we are going to look at some historical facts and events that led the peoples of African origins to think of themselves primarily and solely as Africans. I was born and I grew up in Cameroon, but I've been living in Italy since 2016. And when I meet people from Italy or from some other European countries, some of them often ask me things like, hey man, do you speak African? Initially, I would start explaining to the person that there is not an African language called African, but that there are many African languages, about 2,200 different languages with different names and different linguistic and grammatical structures, and that the language I speak, which is called Bamun, is used only in a tiny region of West Cameroon, and that Bamun is not even closer to being a national language in my country. But all of this explanation was before I became a civilized indigenous. So now I've stopped explaining. So when someone asked me this question, I would reply by saying something like, of course I speak African, is my mother tongue. But if the person does not get the sarcasm in my utterance, at this point they will go on and say, and how do you say good morning in African? At this point I would figure that the case is hopeless. So I would say, well, here is how we say good morning in African, and I will go. Anyways, my point is that for many people that I've met and for many Black Africans themselves, Africa is just one big country with one big but united population. And if we look at Africa as one big and united group, this would mean that there is no difference between a person from Senegal or a person from Madagascar or between a Sudanese and a Somalian. And that, of course, is wrong as far as I'm concerned. But the question to be asked is, how did we get here? It all began with imperialism and the expansion of the European explorers into the region south of the Sahara Desert. Before this expansion, the term Africa had no meaning, or at least not the meaning we give it today. As a matter of fact, philologists and linguists and historians have tried to trace and to reconstruct the etymology of the term Africa, and some of them have proposed explanations, of which I would like to give you a few examples. One of the many explanations is that the name Africa came from Africa, which was another name of Carthage, and Carthage was a Phoenician city founded in the 5th century BC on the banks of the Tunis River, and the term Africa itself derives from the Semitic term faraka, which means to divide or to separate. Africa, in fact, was used to refer to the Phoenician colonies in North Africa. Another interesting explanation is that the name Africa originated from the name of Prophet Abraham's grandson, Ephor, whose descendants are said to have invaded Libya. And as you can see, in neither of these cases, the original terms intended to refer to all the various kingdoms and tribes that populated the entire African continent. The two terms referred only to North Africa, but I do not want us to go into semantics and etymology of terms any deeper than that. So let's return to imperialism, and let's remember that the European explorers landed on the shores of sub-Saharan Africa at the end of the 15th century, and that at their arrival, they surely stumbled upon immense cultural and linguistic diversities, in front of which they essentially had two choices, as far as I'm concerned. The first choice would have been to systematically study and classify the different cultures and languages they came across in Africa. And even though this task might have been unpleasant for them, it would have contributed to a deeper understanding of the African reality, which is diversity in all aspects of life. The second choice they had was to put in the same bundle all the cultures and languages and people they encountered in the African continent, grouping them under the same nomenclature such as primitives or savages or just Africans for those of the European explorers who, in those years, wanted to be politically correct. But all things considered, it seems that the Europeans didn't waste much time before coming to a final decision. They unfortunately chose the second option. They decided that everybody in Africa was to be called African, and that was it. It seems that they had more important and urgent stuff to deal with. And now, I am aware that by making these statements, I might give the impression that I am here trying to be the judge of history, but that is not my intention. I am not here to determine who is guilty of what and who is not. What I'm trying to do instead is to objectively observe what happened and why it did happen. So why did the European explorers decide to throw all the different African indigenous tribes into the same container? Why did they decide to hold together different peoples with different customs and ideas and beliefs? The answer is very simple as far as I'm concerned. It was very practical and convenient for the European explorers to see the entire sub-Saharan Africa as one homogeneous group of cultures, languages, and ideas. The different black African individuals were as similar to one another as they were different from the white European explorers. For the European explorers, on the one hand, there was Europe, where nations and individuals could be distinguished from one another, where everyone had their own subjective identity. And on the other hand, there was Africa, a foreign and alien land, where everyone was similar, if not equal to the whole group, and where the whole group was similar to the single individual. And nowadays, I think it's absurd to have to remind people that an African from Angola is as different from an African from Sudan as an Irish person is different from an Italian, or a Korean from a Japanese. But for the European explorers in Africa, everything was so simple and so obvious. For them, everyone was part of the same big tribe, and that big tribe was to be called Africa. And this shortcut allowed the European explorers to kill two birds with one stone, metaphorically speaking. I do not want to overload their criminal record with a misunderstanding on birds' mass killing in Africa. But what I mean is that this sidestep they took by calling everyone African made it possible for them to justify the slave trade on the one hand, and on the other hand to justify colonialism. But why do I say that? If for the Portuguese or the French slave traders, for example, all Africans were the same people, this automatically meant that they were all equally subhumans, humans without history, humans without identity nor subjectivity, and therefore they were all beings without past, nor present or future. In this way, it was very much easier for the slave traders to treat them all as slaves, or even worse than that, as animals. For the slave traders, for example, beating the drums and dancing was heathenish and barbaric, but writing opera song was a civilized endeavor. Being an indigenous storyteller, the so-called griot, was an activity that could not enjoy the same prestige as the European performing arts, like lyric operas or theater. So the soulless indigenous peoples of Africa had to serve the white Western Christians, and this is why many black Africans were deported to the sugarcane plantations in the far-flung transatlantic regions. And a few centuries later, it was no longer slavery but Western colonialism that needed to be justified. Here again, the solution was obvious to the colonizers. All the African indigenous were just one set of individuals, and all of them were equally primitive and savages. They were all beings without culture and with a backward and regressive mentality. And these indigenous people were, and here I take up a metaphor dear to the British poet Rudyard Kipling, they were the white man's burden. With this metaphor, which was actually the title of a poem, Kipling was not referring to the European explorers, but he was definitely exhorting and encouraging North Americans in their quote-unquote mission during the so-called Philippine-American War. So the white man's burden was a way for Kipling to justify Western colonialism by stating that it was the white man's job to quote-unquote civilize the savage inhabitants of the tropical forests. So when the Cameroonian in our initial scenario introduces himself by saying, "I am from Africa" or "I am an African," he is unconsciously regurgitating the whole Western imperialist and colonialist narratives. When black Africans identified themselves primarily as Africans and not as Samburu, Maasai, Ashanti, Bambara or Baka, it is simply because the slave traders first and the colonizers after them found it more convenient and comfortable to call them that way. But if the idea that all the cultures and languages and people of Africa were all equal to one another was initially a Western invention to make slavery and colonialism handier and more manageable task, this idea was paradoxically taken up and forwarded by the same black activists and politicians whose intention was to quote-unquote liberate all peoples of African descent from the Western colonial yoke. If the expression "we are all Africans" is still very much fashionable and trendy nowadays in all African or Afro-diasporic cycles, it is because of the so-called geopolitical unity in the primary sense of geography and politics of the quote-unquote African peoples against a so-called common enemy. With the advent of anti-colonial struggles, some black activists, politicians and intellectuals, who we should temporarily call Pan-Africanists, used the African geopolitical unity argument as a lever to ideologically gather and unite black peoples of different socio-political and cultural backgrounds on the one hand, and on the other hand to put pressure on the European colonizers to withdraw from their African colonies. For those of you that might not know who the Pan-Africanists are, let's just note for the time being that they are all those black activists, politicians, or intellectuals who purport to fight for the quote-unquote freedom of all peoples of African descent living in Africa or in the diasporas. But we'll go deeper into Pan-Africanism in the next episode. So for some of these Pan-Africanist activists, all the sub-Saharan indigenous tribes were and are first and foremost one big black African tribe, despite the immense linguistic and ethnocultural diversity that irreversibly separates them. For these activists, Africa was and it's still a large peninsula, and its peoples are first and foremost one African people. If we take, for example, Kwame Nkrumah, who was the first president of the independent Ghana and a Pan-African revolutionary, according to Kwame Nkrumah, Africa is an objective geographical fact. No matter the fact that the Berlin Conference resulted in the arbitrary segmentation of Africa into small nation-states, all the African peoples, as far as Kwame Nkrumah was concerned, were citizens of the same nation. They were citizens who had a common interest, namely the struggle for the independence of the African continent. And now one could object by saying that Africa, as presented by the highly respectable Kwame Nkrumah, is somewhat artificial as a concept, as were these lines drawn by the European explorers at the infamous Berlin Conference in 1884. In other words, just as at the Berlin Conference, Otto von Bismarck and his colonizing partners had ruthlessly broken up Africa into small states without taking into account the ethnocultural and linguistic continuity between the different indigenous groups, Kwame Nkrumah, and with the anxiety similar to that of a newly liberated prisoner, Kwame Nkrumah wanted to stitch together all the pieces of the continent without taking into account the same ethnocultural and linguistic and sometimes even religious differences that were so present and so alive in Africa. Now, one does not need to be a researcher in cultural geography to realize that both the approach of German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, who summoned the Berlin Conference, and that of the Pan-African revolutionary Kwame Nkrumah were wrong. If we all agree on the fact that Africa shouldn't have been divided into small, disparate states, I think that we would all agree on the idea that neither should have the diverse African ethnic groups been homogenized into a monolithic continental bloc, which was what Kwame Nkrumah intended to do, and actually what it did. And I would expect people to argue that uniting the peoples of Africa was the only way to fight off the Western colonial yoke. But as convincing as this argument may sound, I think that if we can and should all agree with Kwame Nkrumah in saying that Africa is one geographical fact, is it really the case that there is one African people? In other words, is there an African culture or identity or even a language that unites all the African peoples? Answering these questions imply bringing in my personal opinion, but before we get there, I would like to make it clear for everyone that I neither intend to justify the Western colonialist narrative, but nor do I intend to cuddle the communalist and the communitarian narrative held by many contemporary Pan-Africanist activists. As a civilized indigenous, I feel compelled to interrogate both these narratives, and especially the Pan-Africanist narrative. Moreover, I think that advocating or pleading in favor of an ideal doesn't necessarily mean that we should exalt and glorify its strengths and victories. I think the best way we can promote an ideal is by pointing out and reflecting on its limitations and weaknesses. As Thomas Kuhn would say, it is crises that make paradigms evolve. So I am not here to boast about how much I love Africa or how badly I want to save black peoples around the globe. I am here to ask unpleasant questions and to interrogate facts, and from time to time to offer my indigenous and civilized opinion on how I think we can best help Africa. So going back to our question, is there an African culture or identity that unites all the African peoples? My answer is no. I think there isn't such a thing as a united African people. If, geographically speaking, we can say that Africa is a single continental block or a giant peninsula, the same thing cannot be said about the different ethnocultural, linguistic, and religious groups that inhabit the African continent. There is not an African identity, not even a national identity in the different African states. The reality in Africa is that there are many ethno-tribal identities. In a country like Cameroon, for instance, there are over 250 different ethnic groups, and these groups speak different idioms, and most importantly, they have different customs and values. And everybody agrees in saying that this diversity is a measureless wealth for Africa. And here is a concrete example of what this actually means. If we take a newborn child who is learning the language of the environment in which he or she lives, that is to say his or her first language or the so-called mother tongue, while the child's phonatory or auditory organs specialize themselves in that first language, These same organs simultaneously become numb and unable to reproduce or to distinguish the phonemes or sounds of other languages. And this is probably why in countries where only one language is spoken, it is sometimes difficult for the citizens of that country to learn another language. But if the same child lives in a multicultural and a multilingual region where several languages are spoken, the child's cognitive and sensory specialization in his or her mother tongue will not prevent his or her phonatory or auditory organs from maintaining their sensitiveness to other phonemes or sounds that are not present in the language being learned. Therefore, it is clear that the cultural and the linguistic diversities of the African continent is an asset and a wealth for its people. But this same wealth has also been a misfortune, if not a curse, upon Africa. But why do I say that? Peoples of different ethnic backgrounds often hold different or even opposite ideals or beliefs, which makes it difficult for them to form a national identity. National identity, however, is the backbone, the foundation on which the basic principles of democracy stand. And here I would like to call our attention to the fact that the term democracy derives from two Greek words, demos, which means common people, and kratos, which means rule or strength. So whenever we talk about democracy, we also should be talking about a direct and self-government of all the people, by all the people, and for all the people. But as you can see, this definition already presumes the existence of a people pertaining to one nation, that is, a group of individuals who share at least one common interest. But unfortunately, or fortunately enough, Africa is not a nation. There is not such a thing as one African people united by a common interest. The different African nations have the possibility and even the potential of uniting around one national identity, but Africa does not, simply because each African nation has an interest that can be different or even contradictory to the interests of other nations. And here I would like to point out that fighting the quote-unquote common enemy is the only thing around which many Pan-Africanist activists have united so far. And having a common enemy does not even help that much. As a matter of fact, having a common enemy and not a common interest or common values or ideals can have two implications. It may imply that the peoples are united, that they join forces in fighting the quote-unquote enemy. But as soon as the enemy is defeated and driven away, the same peoples would self-destruct in inter-tribal conflicts in order to gain exclusive access and control over resources. The second implication might be that a fraction of the so-called united people, who are usually a tiny minority self-proclaimed representative leaders of the people, this fraction would ally with the enemy against their quote-unquote brothers, and for the same reasons, namely to have exclusive access and control over resources. Both these situations lead to dramatic and painful consequences, which undermine the economic, cultural, and socio-political development of a region, be it a nation or a continent. And the history of the African continent is here to bear witness to all of this.